Imagine, you wake up, and half of your city is simply gone. The sky is choked with black smoke. The streets rot in dead silence. This isn't a Hollywood apocalypse movie. This is the reality of 1347, the deadliest pandemic in human history. An invisible, absolutely ruthless killer. The Black Death wiped out up to 200 million people. That is more than the casualties of both world wars combined. Plague doctors in creepy beaked masks were powerless. Kings died, just like beggars. Gold and power lost all meaning when blood turned black beneath the skin. But where did this ancient curse come from? Who opened the gates to hell? And how did a handful of survivors manage to build our modern world? Today, we will follow the bloody trail of the great and terrible plague. You will discover secrets of the Black Death, never mentioned in your textbooks. The 14th century. Europe is experiencing an era of unprecedented prosperity and rapid growth. Cities are expanding rapidly, trade and crafts flourish, and magnificent cathedrals are built. Endless caravans loaded with spices and silk travel along the Great Silk Road. No one suspects that these trade routes will become the veins of an infected world. Medieval cities were overcrowded. Narrow, dark streets were drowning in absolute filth. People threw garbage straight out of their windows. It was a true paradise for rats. But the plague itself originated far to the east, in the steppes of Central Asia. The bacteria, Yersinia pestis, slumbered for millennia in populations of wild marmots. Severe climate changes forced these infected animals to migrate closer to human settlements. Fleas feeding on their blood transferred the deadly bacteria directly to black rats. And rats always followed humans, sneaking into our barns and our ships. At the same time, the Mongol Empire was actively uniting the lands of Eurasia. The armies of the Khans moved at incredible speed, carrying an invisible death. 1346. The wealthy trading city of Kaffa, in Crimea. The Golden Horde besieges the city, but a deadly plague strikes the Mongols. Khan Yani Beg realizes he is losing, and makes a cruel, unprecedented decision. He orders his catapults to be loaded with the corpses of his plague-ridden soldiers. The dead bodies fly over the fortress walls, sowing panic and disease inside. This was the very first use of biological weapons of mass destruction in history. The defenders of Kaffa flee in terror to their ships, hoping to escape. Italian merchants hastily raise their sails and head towards Genoa. They thought they had escaped certain death in the besieged city, but hiding in the holds of their galleys were hordes of infected black rats. The death ships entered the open sea. There was no turning back. October 1347. The death ships arrive at the port of Messina, Sicily. The locals approach the galleys, but find a terrifying scene of absolute nightmare. Most of the sailors are already dead. The survivors are screaming in unimaginable pain. Their bodies are covered in agonizing black boils that ooze blood and pus. The authorities order the ships to leave, but it is already too late. Infected rats scurry down the mooring ropes, blending into the shadows of the city. The Black Death has officially entered Europe, and the apocalypse begins immediately. The disease spreads like wildfire. In just days, Messina turns into a ghost town. Fleeing citizens carry the bacteria to Genoa, Venice, and Florence. Florence, the jewel of the Renaissance, loses half of its population in months. Family ties are completely destroyed. Parents abandon their sick children, fleeing in terror. Carts roam the streets at night, as drivers shout, "Bring out your dead." The symptoms were brutal. First, a sudden fever and excruciating chills. Then, massive swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, appeared on the neck and groin. Black, necrotic spots spread across the skin, giving the plague its dark name. Death usually came within 3 to 5 days. There was absolutely no cure. By 1348, the invisible wave crashed into France and Spain. It crossed the English Channel, creeping into the foggy streets of London. Graveyards overflowed. They had to dig massive trench pits for mass burials. Society was collapsing entirely. Courts closed, farms were abandoned, and crops rotted. People turned to medicine, but medieval doctors were completely blind to the truth. They blamed the disease on a miasma, a toxic cloud of bad air. Doctors recommended sniffing sweet flowers, or sitting next to blazing hot fires. They prescribed brutal bloodletting, which only killed the weakened patients much faster. Astrologers claimed the plague was caused by an evil alignment of the planets. Some desperate souls even drank crushed emeralds, or bathed in pure vinegar. Nothing worked. The death toll climbed into the tens of millions. Believing this was the wrath of God, Europe plunged into extreme religious fanaticism. Cults of flagellants roamed from town to town, whipping themselves in public squares. They bled onto the cobblestones, begging for divine forgiveness. But their bloody rituals only helped spread the infection even further. Fear turned into paranoia. People desperately searched for a scapegoat to blame. Witch hunts began, targeting foreigners, lepers, and religious minorities. Thousands of innocent people were burned at the stake, in horrific mob violence. The world felt like it was ending, a true literal hell on earth. But even in this pitch-black darkness, the seeds of a new world were being planted. By 1353, the unstoppable wave of death finally began to recede. Europe was left in a state of absolute shock and eerie silence. Entire villages were left completely abandoned. Nature began to reclaim the ruins. But for the survivors, a strange and unexpected new reality was waiting. With up to half of the population gone, the feudal system collapsed. Lords owned vast amounts of land, but had absolutely no one to work it. Fields grew wild, and castles stood empty. Labor became the most valuable resource. For centuries, peasants were treated like slaves, tied to the land of their masters. But suddenly, the surviving workers realized they had absolute power. If a lord refused to pay higher wages, the peasants simply walked away. They demanded actual money, better food, and the right to choose their employers. Desperate noblemen tried to pass strict laws to freeze wages and restrict movement. But it was useless. You cannot negotiate with the laws of supply and demand. This sparked massive uprisings across Europe, like the English peasants' revolt. Armed with scythes and pitchforks, the lower classes demanded total freedom from serfdom. The elites crushed the rebellions in blood, but the old world was already dead. The chains of serfdom were broken forever. A new social class was being born. Ordinary people suddenly inherited the wealth and lands of their dead relatives. The standard of living for the surviving poor skyrocketed to unprecedented levels. They ate fresh meat, wore fine clothes, and drank expensive wine. Wealth was redistributed on a massive scale. The foundations of modern capitalism were laid. But the economic shift was only half of the great transformation. The absolute power of the Catholic Church had been deeply shaken. People prayed for salvation. The priests promised mercy, but died just like everyone else. The empty promises of the clergy caused a profound crisis of faith. Survivors began to question authority and look for answers outside of religion. Universities shifted their focus from theology to medicine, science, and human anatomy. The concept of humanism emerged, focusing on the value of human life on Earth. This intellectual revolution would soon explode into the magnificent era of the Renaissance. The Black Death, paradoxically, pulled humanity out of the Dark Ages. It forced medicine to evolve, relying on observation and science instead of ancient myths. It led to the invention of quarantine, a practice that still saves millions today. Cities built organized sanitation systems, realizing that filth was the enemy of life, and a massive surplus of abandoned clothes provided cheap rags for paper production. This directly paved the way for Gutenberg's revolutionary printing press. The horrific end of one era was the violent, bloody birth of another. The Black Death eventually faded, but it never truly vanished. It returned to Europe in smaller waves for the next 300 years. But humanity adapted. We learned, we rebuilt, and we evolved. In fact, the descendants of the survivors carry a unique genetic legacy. A specific genetic mutation that protected them from the plague is the exact same mutation that provides resistance to HIV today. The shadow of the Black Death is literally written in our DNA. And what about the bacteria itself? Yersinia pestis is still alive. Cases still appear today in places like Madagascar, and even the United States. But today, a simple course of antibiotics stops the ancient killer in its tracks. The medieval apocalypse is now just a treatable infection. The plague was humanity's darkest hour, the ultimate reset button. It proved that even after the end of the world, life finds a way. If you want to uncover more dark secrets of history, hit that subscribe button. Leave a like, and tell us in the comments what event we should explore next.